Chapter 2 is on chemistry, and chemistry can be a bit difficult, but we're only going to be covering basic chemistry and the chemistry that applies to the human body. So keep that in mind. So, our first slide here is on matter and energy. Matter is anything that takes up mass and occupies space. So matter can be seen, it can be smelled, and it can also be felt. Now, weight is mass plus the effects of gravity. So what that means is that our weight is going to be less once we're in orbit or once we're on the moon, for example. As far as we're concerned, there are various states of matter that are in three possible states. First of all would be solid, which has a definite shape and volume. This, of course, would be things like the contents of the GI tract. So, what's in the small intestine and the large intestine. Another form of matter would be liquid, which has a changeable shape and definite volume. So, this would be something like the blood plasma. And there's then, of course, gas, which is going to change to the shape and volume. So it will spread out or diffuse. This would be things like oxygen and carbon dioxide, which does travel in the blood plasma, but then once we exhale it, it's in gaseous form in the form of carbon dioxide. Energy is the capacity to do work or put matter into motion. And the two primary types of energy, first of all, are kinetic versus potential. Kinetic means that it's the energy of movement, and potential is stored or inactive energy. And energy can be transformed from potential to kinetic energy. The forms of energy that we'll be talking about throughout the semester are things like chemical energy, which we'll discuss in this chapter, and that energy is stored in bonds of chemical substances. Electrical energy is movement of charged particles. So think nervous system energy. Mechanical energy would be from the muscular system, for example. Radiant or electromagnetic energy travels in waves, and what applies to us is the visible spectrum. It's the part of that electromagnetic spectrum that we actually can see. And we'll be discussing this in chapter 15 at the end of the semester. So energy, as I mentioned, can be converted from one form to another. So atoms and elements, all matter is composed of these elements, and an element is a substance that cannot be broken down into a simple substance by ordinary chemical methods. With like nuclear chemistry, it can be broken down, but we're not talking about those examples. So, as I mentioned in the chapter 1 videos, 96% of the body is these four main elements, which is very important to know. And 9 of them only make up 3.9% of the body, and 11 make less than 0.01%. So, it's very important for you to know these four elements: carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and nitrogen. All elements are made up of atoms, which are the building blocks for each element, and they're the smallest particles of an element. So you've all seen a periodic table at one point in your education, so you're well familiar with an atomic symbol. Usually it's the first letter or the first two letters of the element, but there are some exceptions to that. But one of the normal ones would be O for oxygen, C for carbon, but some of them are actually derived from their Latin names. So one example would be sodium, Na, which comes from the Latin word naturium. K is for potassium, and that comes from the Latin word kalium. But you should definitely know that Na is sodium and K is potassium. So this table on this slide is going to be very, very important for you to know. The specific percentages are not important, besides the fact that you need to know that these four are 96% of the human body. So I'm going to go ahead and cross off the individual percentages because you're not responsible for them. But there may be lots of questions from this table, and what is important is that you know the biological significance of these elements. So you should know the element, the symbol, and a little bit about them. So let's go through some of those. First, I'm going to highlight the name of the element and the atomic symbol to know. And this, again, is another example of where note cards can be especially helpful, like I mentioned in chapter 1. So I definitely would recommend making a note card for each of these. So for oxygen, it is an organic, which means carbon containing, and it also can be in an inorganic form, but as a gas, it's used for the production of cellular energy, which is called ATP. Carbon is kind of the backbone of all organic molecules. In fact, the word organic means that it contains carbon. So carbon is the basis of carbohydrates, lipids, which are fats, and oils, proteins, and nucleic acids. And we're going to talk a lot about that this chapter. Those are the four main macromolecules in the human body. Hydrogen influences pH, and it's also referred to as a proton, as an ion, but it influences the pH to make it more acidic. So it becomes acidic with the higher amount of hydrogen. And we represent that with a plus, which will make more sense later on in the chapter. Calcium, as you already know, is a salt in bones and teeth. In the ionic form, it's required for muscle contraction, nerve impulses, and blood clotting. Phosphorus is also a salt in bones and teeth, and it's in nucleic acids like DNA, part of ATP, and phospholipids. Potassium as an ion is the major cation that's inside the cell. It's important for nerve impulses and muscle contraction. Sulfur is important for proteins, muscle proteins especially. Sodium in its ionic form is the major positive ion in the extracellular fluid, which is outside of the cell, also for water balance, nerve impulses, and muscle contraction. Chloride or chlorine, as an ion, it's called chloride, and it's the most abundant negative ion in the extracellular fluid. Magnesium is present in bone, and it's also important for metabolic reactions. Iodine is important for thyroid hormones, and iron is in hemoglobin, which is what transports oxygen within red blood cells, and also some enzymes. Some of these minor ones, you don't need to worry about those. It's just the ones that are on this table. So again, these are some exceptions like iron. It's not IR, it's Fe because it comes from the Latin word ferrous. Ferrous. But you need to know the atomic symbol for iron is Fe.